The fire snapped under a Texas sky streaked with gold and dust. Beyond the barbed wire, a dozen young women in gray uniforms stood frozen. Not from fear, but disbelief. The smell in the air was something they had never known. Smoke, sweetness, meat sizzling on open flames. An American sergeant flipped a rack of ribs with the calm precision of a man who had seen too much war. He glanced toward the silent group and said softly, "It's just dinner, not a trick." One of the prisoners, 19-year-old Helene Fisher, a former Luftwaffe radio operator, hesitated. For months she had been told that Americans tortured their captives, that surrender meant humiliation, or worse. Yet here, in the fading light of a Texas evening, the enemy was smiling and handing her a plate. She took a bite. Smoke, salt, and sweetness hit her tongue at once. The taste was so rich it hurt. Her eyes filled with tears. Around her, the other women followed, one by one, until the silence broke into quiet laughter and something else, relief. For the first time, they weren't soldiers or prisoners or propaganda's ghosts. They were just people eating together. What none of them understood in that moment was that this simple meal, ribs and beans under a southern sunset, would become a weapon more powerful than bullets. Because the Reich had built its empire on fear. And that night, under the scent of hickory smoke, fear began to die. By the winter of 1944, the German war machine was running on fumes. Men were dying faster than they could be replaced. So, for the first time, the Reich turned to women, not as mothers or nurses, but as soldiers of the rear lines. They were clerks, switchboard operators, mechanics, and anti-aircraft auxiliaries. Most were in their late teens or early 20s, raised on slogans, trained in obedience, and promised glory in a war already lost. They wore gray uniforms and iron crosses on their collars, but their battlefield wasn't in the trenches. It was in offices, in radar rooms, on factory floors that shook with distant thunder. They worked 12-hour shifts tracking bombers they could never stop, writing messages for generals they would never meet. And yet they believed, because from the age of 6, they'd been told one thing: the enemy is a monster. America, they said, was a land of chaos, a place where prisoners were starved, where German honor would be mocked and crushed. So when Allied forces swept across Europe, capturing thousands of these young women, terror took hold. Some tried to hide their uniforms. Others swallowed small vials of cyanide, convinced that captivity was worse than death. Those who survived were loaded onto transport ships bound for a place they had only read about, the United States. The voyage was long, silent, and full of dread. Helene Fisher, the young radio operator who would later taste barbecue in Texas, wrote in her diary during the crossing, "If we are not killed, they will surely use us for work until we die." But what awaited her on the other side wasn't punishment. It was contradiction and confusion. Because when those ships docked, the first thing the prisoners saw was not barbed wire or rifles. It was a Red Cross banner and rows of tents filled with doctors. The Americans treated them, fed them, examined them, spoke softly to them in halting German. Many POWs broke down in tears, ashamed of their fear, ashamed of what they had believed. In camps like Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia, and Camp Hearn, Texas, life was something between captivity and community. The women slept in clean bunks. They received mail from home. They were even paid a small wage for daily labor. Some were suspicious. Some were angry. But all of them were beginning to realize that the world outside Hitler's speeches was far more complicated than they had ever imagined. One night, as guards switched off the lights, Helene whispered to another prisoner, "If this is how they treat enemies, what does that make us?" The question hung in the dark, unanswered. It was the kind of question that could unravel an empire. And the unraveling had just begun. Because in the land they'd been taught to hate, they were about to meet something they couldn't comprehend: hospitality. When the first trains rolled into the American South, townsfolk gathered along the tracks, curious, cautious, whispering. Inside the cars sat rows of German women, pale and stiff in their gray uniforms. They didn't look like the monsters in the newspapers. They looked young, tired, human. The guards opened the doors. Heat hit like a wave, dry, heavy, endless. Texas summer. The women squinted against the light. Somewhere nearby, a radio played swing music. It sounded like another planet. Locals expected danger, but what arrived instead were polite voices and nervous smiles. Some of the prisoners even tried broken English greetings. "Good day? Please water?" Children stared wide-eyed. A few offered apples through the fence before their parents could stop them. Inside the camps, shock turned to disbelief. There were no dungeons, no whips, just neat rows of barracks, shaded paths, and a canteen that smelled of coffee. Every morning, guards checked roll call, then offered breakfast. Eggs, bread, fruit. It was more food than most of these women had seen in months. At first, they refused to eat, convinced it was a trick. But hunger has its own logic. On the third morning, one woman, name lost to history, took a bite. Nothing happened. No poison. No mockery. Only taste. Word spread quickly. By week's end, the dining hall echoed with cautious chatter, spoons clinking against metal trays. The Americans called it routine. The Germans called it impossible. As days turned into weeks, something remarkable unfolded. The camps began to feel less like prisons and more like small towns. They had libraries, gardens, and even makeshift theaters. Prisoners painted murals of the Alps on mess hall walls. Guards brought in instruments. A violin here, an old accordion there, until, at night, the camp fences trembled with music. The U.S. government allowed it all. Not out of pity but purpose. They believed morale made better prisoners and better propaganda. Photographs of well-treated captives were quietly circulated across Europe. The message was subtle but devastating. The enemy is not who you think. Still, not everyone was comfortable. Some guards had lost friends to the Luftwaffe. Some locals resented seeing prisoners so well fed while rationing sugar and gasoline themselves. But when anger rose, compassion had a way of softening it. A guard might see a prisoner cry reading a letter from home, and remember that grief sounded the same in every language. One night at Camp Hearn, a storm ripped through the plains. Lightning snapped the sky open, tearing roofs, flooding fields. When morning came, the guards expected chaos. Instead, they found prisoners rebuilding fences, carrying sandbags, helping the Americans repair what the wind had destroyed. That day, the commandant wrote in his journal, "They act not as captives, but as neighbors." The psychological shift was underway. The Germans had come expecting vengeance. What they found was mercy, wrapped in barbed wire and barbecue smoke. And that mercy was about to take a flavor they would never forget. Because the Americans had another idea, a Southern tradition meant to teach the enemy one more unexpected lesson. The Texas sun had just started to sink when the smell of smoke began to drift through Camp Hearn. Not the bitter smoke of gunfire, the kind they remembered from the ruins of Berlin, but something thicker, richer, alive. From the open yard, the prisoners saw guards hauling out barrels, setting up long wooden tables, laughing as they stoked the coals. The air shimmered with heat and something stranger, curiosity. One of the camp officers, Captain Lewis Ford, had an idea that no one in Washington would have dared approve on paper. He called it a peace experiment. The locals called it a barbecue. He'd invited townspeople to join, men who'd lost brothers in the war, women who'd sent sons overseas. And yet, here they were, side by side with the enemy, tending fires under the same sky. The German women were ordered to attend. They lined up at the edge of the yard, tense and motionless, watching smoke curl upward into the orange light. A young soldier flipped the first slab of ribs. Fat hissed on the grill, spitting flames. The sound, sharp, rhythmic, primal, drew every pair of eyes. No one spoke. Then came the smell. Sweet, peppery, impossibly inviting. One of the women, Helene Fisher, closed her eyes. For a moment, she was a child again. Back home in Cologne before the bombings, before the propaganda, before the war had stolen the taste of joy. An American sergeant approached with a plate. He didn't smile, didn't taunt. He just said, "Ma'am, you're free to eat." Helene hesitated, then took it. The meat was soft, the sauce thick and smoky, nothing like the gray bread and watery soup of the past years. When she bit down, she froze. Tears welled before she could stop them. The guard stared, unsure what to do. Then another woman laughed quietly. Then another. A ripple went through the group, small at first, then rising like a wave. Laughter. Real laughter. A sound that hadn't existed in that camp since the day they arrived. Local families joined them. Children passed plates through the wire. Someone found an accordion. Within an hour, the campyard was alive with sound, German songs blending with American ones. A few guards sang along. Some pretended not to, but tapped their boots to the rhythm anyway. No speeches were made. No politics. Just the rhythm of fire and the scent of smoke. Later that night, after the tables were cleared, Captain Ford wrote in his logbook, "I think this is what victory should feel like. Not revenge, but relief." For the prisoners, that evening was almost spiritual. One wrote in her diary, "We expected to be punished. Instead, they fed us. And for a moment, I felt forgiven." The barbecue didn't just feed bodies. It cracked open minds. It dismantled everything they thought they knew about America, about the enemy, about themselves. Back in Germany, Hitler's speeches had described Americans as weak, decadent, soulless consumers of pleasure. But here, surrounded by warmth and generosity, that narrative collapsed like paper in the rain. The truth was simple. America's real weapon wasn't its bombs. It was its abundance and its willingness to share it. As Helene stared into the dying fire, she whispered to her friend beside her, "If kindness can taste like this, what else did they lie about?" No one answered. But that question, simple, trembling, dangerous, would echo across every letter, every story, every life touched by that night. Because the war for these women didn't end in surrender. It ended in understanding. And in the days that followed, the smoke of that barbecue would carry farther than anyone imagined. In the days after the barbecue, something intangible lingered in the camp air. The scent of smoke, the echo of laughter, and the quiet unease of people who had felt something they weren't supposed to feel. For the first time, the German women didn't wake to the sound of fear. They woke to questions. Why had they been told these people were animals? Why did kindness feel more disarming than cruelty? Why did the enemy feed them better than their own command ever had? Helene Fisher wrote in her diary that week, "We've been living in darkness. The light burns our eyes now, but it feels like truth." It wasn't just her. Letters intercepted by American censors told the same story. Prisoners were writing home, not to condemn their captors, but to praise them. One woman described generous meals, music, and men who treat us as equals. Another wrote, "If this is the enemy, then I no longer know who we are." Those letters terrified Nazi officials. They ordered censors to destroy or rewrite POW correspondence to prevent ideological contamination. But it was too late. Reality had crossed the ocean, wrapped in ink and memory. In Camp Hearn, the Americans noticed the shift too. Work crews volunteered more eagerly. Tensions faded. And in the evenings, music drifted from the barracks. Soft, uncertain at first, then swelling into harmonies that blurred the line between prisoner and guard. A young lieutenant recorded in his journal, "They sing in German. We don't know the words, but somehow it sounds like peace." Psychologists later studied what happened in those camps and gave it a name: cognitive dissonance, when the truth collides so hard with belief that the mind begins to rewrite itself. These women had grown up in a world of absolutes: obedience, purity, hate. Now the absolutes were cracking. If the enemy was kind, maybe the fatherland wasn't righteous. If compassion was weakness, why did it feel so strong? Every meal, every song, every shared smile became a quiet act of rebellion against everything the Reich had taught them. Helene became one of the translators for the American staff, a role that gave her rare freedom. She began to read Allied newspapers, learning about the Holocaust, about Germany's atrocities, things she had once dismissed as propaganda. Each headline hit her like shrapnel. She confided to a friend one night, "If half of this is true, then maybe we deserve to lose." The friend didn't answer. She just stared at the fence, the stars beyond it, and whispered, "Then maybe losing is the only way to start again." That line spread through the camp, quietly, cautiously, until it became almost a saying among the prisoners. Maybe losing is the only way to start again. And that's what was happening invisibly across America's POW system. Defeat was transforming into education. Shame was morphing into reflection. And enemy minds, once chained by ideology, were slowly learning to breathe. By the summer of 1945, when word of Germany's surrender reached Texas, the camps erupted, not in grief, but in stunned silence. The women gathered in small groups, some weeping, others smiling faintly. Helene wrote just one sentence that day: "The world we were told to die for no longer exists." But she was wrong about one thing. Something did exist. Something new, fragile, and powerful. It had been born in fire and smoke, over shared meals and unexpected grace. And when the time came for these women to go home, that quiet revolution would follow them across the sea. When the war finally ended, the gates of Camp Hearn swung open. Trucks rumbled into the yard, carrying orders stamped release and repatriate. The women packed quietly. For months they had dreamed of home, of Germany, of family, of normalcy. But now, the thought of leaving filled many with unease. Helene Fisher stood by her bunk, holding the same metal plate she'd used during that first barbecue. The smoke stains had faded, but she refused to throw it away. It wasn't just a souvenir. It was proof that kindness had once found her on the other side of the world. At the train station, locals lined the tracks again, just like when the POWs had first arrived. But this time, no one whispered. Children waved. Women from the town handed out sandwiches, fruit, and postcards. A few prisoners, now friends, embraced their guards with quiet tears. "Good luck," one soldier said. "Build something better." Helene nodded, unable to answer. When the ships carrying them home reached Europe, Germany was barely recognizable. Cities lay in rubble. The air stank of smoke and shame. For many of these women, the kindness of their captors felt more like home than the homeland itself. Some were interrogated by Allied officers who couldn't believe the stories. That American guards shared food, that small towns hosted barbecues for their prisoners. But it was all true. And within a few years, those small acts of decency began to ripple outward. Historians later called it soft power before soft power, because those camps, built for containment, became quiet classrooms of humanity. Many of the former POWs became translators, teachers, nurses. They taught English, they baked cornbread in tiny post-war kitchens, they wrote memoirs about compassion in captivity. And a few, like Helene, opened cafes in towns still scarred by bombings. She called hers Zum Rauch, meaning the smoke. On its first menu, she offered one dish that no one in Cologne had ever tasted before: barbecued pork with sweet sauce. When asked why, she smiled and said, "Because I learned that enemies can share a meal, and that's how peace begins." In time, her cafe became a local legend. American soldiers stationed in post-war Germany would eat there, unaware that the owner had once worn the enemy's uniform. Helene never told them. She didn't need to. The war had taken nearly everything: friends, family, faith. But it had given her one thing back: the ability to choose compassion. And that choice spread. Across Germany, similar stories unfolded, of former POWs who carried home fragments of humanity that no bomb could destroy. In their memories, America wasn't a place of cruelty. It was a place where strangers fed them, smiled at them, saw them as human beings. Years later, when historians asked why post-war Germany embraced democracy so quickly, one scholar said, "Because even their prisoners had been treated with dignity." It was the kind of victory no general could plan, the kind that lives not in monuments but in hearts. And for those German women who once stood trembling behind barbed wire, the lesson was simple but eternal. You can conquer a nation with fear, but you can only heal it with kindness. History often remembers the explosions, not the embers that kept humanity alive. But sometimes, peace begins with something as simple as a shared meal. If this story moved you, don't miss our next episode: the Japanese pilot who was forgiven by his victim. Subscribe and remember, The smallest kindness can end the longest war.